she was nobody. A waitress. The kind of woman men looked through, never at. But tonight, in a ballroom full of killers, she pressed a 7-inch blade against the most dangerous throat in Chicago, and not a single man dared breathe. One wrong move, one twitch of her hand, and the entire East Coast criminal empire would drown in blood before the champagne hit the floor. Nobody knew her name an hour ago. Now every gun in the room was pointed at her. If this story grips you, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The knife was 7 inches long, with a black composite handle worn smooth from years of kitchen work, and Celine Hart had hidden it under the dessert table 40 minutes before anyone thought to check that corner of the room. Otan. That was the thing about being invisible. You could move things, arrange things. Nobody watched the woman refilling water glasses. She had spent her entire life being nobody worth watching. Tonight, that was the only reason Adrian Moretti was still breathing. But we need to go back further than tonight. We need to go back to the beginning, to a cold Tuesday morning in November, when a 26-year-old woman with 2 crumpled 20s in her coat pocket and a mother who couldn't stand without help walked into an employment agency on the south side of Chicago and lied about having formal hospitality training. She hadn't lied about much else in her life. She didn't have the energy for it. Celine Hart was thin in the way that people who skip meals get thin, not the kind that comes from choosing salads. Her hair was dark and cut close because long hair was something you maintained when you had time, and she hadn't had time in 3 years. Her hazel eyes were the color of creek water in late autumn, greenish, brownish, neither one thing nor the other, constantly shifting depending on the light and the mood and the particular brand of exhaustion she was carrying that day. She had a scar on her left forearm, 6 inches, running diagonal from below her elbow toward her wrist. She wore long sleeves when she could. When she couldn't, she let people stare. She'd stopped explaining it years ago. The employment agency smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. A woman named Patricia with reading glasses on a beaded chain looked at Celine's application form and then looked at Celine, doing the math that people always did, estimating need versus reliability, desperation versus danger, and apparently decided Celine passed both tests because she made a phone call right there at the desk. "I have someone," Patricia said into the phone. "Quiet. Clean references. She's done residential before." Celine stared at the motivational poster on the wall behind Patricia's head. "Your attitude determines your direction." Someone had drawn a small mustache on the stock photo businessman in the corner. She got the job. The Moretti estate sat on 4 acres in a private suburb 40 minutes northwest of the city, screened from the road by a wall of mature oaks and a black iron fence that looked decorative until you noticed the cameras mounted at 10-foot intervals and the guardhouse at the gate that was always staffed. The house itself was not what movies had trained her to expect. It wasn't ostentatious. It was large, the way old money is large, restrained, solid, everything chosen for permanence rather than display. Stone exterior, deep-set windows, a kitchen the size of her entire apartment, equipped with equipment she'd only ever seen in restaurant supply catalogs. Her first morning, the head housekeeper, a compact Polish woman named Dorota, who communicated primarily through sighs and pointed gestures, walked her through the routine without much explanation. Here's where the linens are folded. Here's the schedule for the formal dining room. Here is what Mr. Moretti takes with his coffee. Do not be in the East Corridor after 9 in the evening. Do not speak to Mr. Moretti unless spoken to first. Do not use the small elevator near the library. That is for household deliveries only. Celine listened. She nodded at the right moments. She asked 2 questions, and they were both practical. Dorota looked at her the way you look at a new appliance that has not yet broken down. Cautious approval. She made Adrian Moretti's coffee wrong on the first morning. Too much water, too little time. And he set the cup down on his desk without saying anything, which she only knew because she walked past the open door of his study and saw it sitting there, full and cooling, while he worked through a document with a red pen. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. The next morning she adjusted the ratio and the timing, and the cup was empty when she came to collect it. That was how their entire relationship worked for the first 3 weeks. He was 41 years old, and he looked like a man who had spent those 41 years making every room he entered slightly colder and more formal. He was not particularly tall. He was not movie handsome in any obvious way. but he had the kind of stillness about him that made you aware of exactly where he was in any given room, the way you're always aware of where the single heavy piece of furniture is, the thing that doesn't move and won't apologize for not moving. His hair was dark, going silver at the temples. His suits were charcoal or navy, always. He had a small, thin scar above his left eyebrow that pulled slightly when he frowned, which was most of the time. She learned quickly that the household staff existed in a delicate ecosystem of deference and strategic invisibility. The senior staff, Dorota, the head of security, a man named Reyes with the neck of a defensive tackle and the eyes of a disappointed schoolteacher, moved through the house with the confidence of people whose utility was established. The junior staff moved the way Celine moved, quietly, efficiently, taking up as little space as possible. She was good at this. She had been practicing it since she was 9 years old, growing up in the Inglewood neighborhood with a mother who worked nights and a block that rewarded stillness and punished noise. You learned to read rooms early when your neighborhood was what Inglewood was in those years. You learned which corner boys were bored and which ones were angry. You learned that the man 2 doors down who smiled at everyone was the one to avoid. You learned that the absence of a sound, a dog that stopped barking, a conversation that went quiet too fast, was often louder than anything you could actually hear. Those instincts had kept her alive and kept her mother fed, and kept her out of situations that swallowed other girls from her block whole. They served her well in the Moretti household too, in ways nobody recognized or asked about. On her 6th day, she noticed that a delivery truck had arrived at the service entrance 20 minutes before the expected window, and that the driver had spoken to the gate guard for nearly 4 minutes, much longer than a routine check required. She mentioned it casually to Dorota, who told Reyes, who ran the plates. The truck was clean, but the driver's employment with the delivery company had ended 2 weeks earlier. It was investigated. Nothing came of it immediately, but Reyes changed the delivery confirmation protocol the following week. Nobody thanked her. Nobody even acknowledged she had said anything. She went back to folding linens. On her 11th day, she was clearing the side table during a business dinner, one of the formal events the household hosted regularly. Men in good suits eating food they barely tasted while conducting conversations that were never quite about what they appeared to be about. When she noticed the wine steward sweating in a way that had nothing to do with the kitchen's heat, his hands were too steady. That was the tell. When a man is genuinely calm, his hands move with small natural variations. When a man is forcing himself to appear calm, his hands are artificially, precisely still. She watched him for 11 minutes over 3 passes through the room. When she carried a tray back to the kitchen, she paused beside Reyes, who was stationed near the service entrance the way he always was during formal events, and said quietly, without looking at him, "The wine steward is nervous about something specific, not general nerves. Something specific." Reyes looked at her for a long moment. "Do your job," he said. She did her job. 40 minutes later, the wine steward was escorted from the premises by 2 of Reyes's men. She never found out what they found. She never asked. The dinner continued without interruption, and the guests never knew anything had happened. Reyes did not thank her. But the next week, when a junior staff member was being reassigned to a different position, Celine was not on the list. Small things. Invisible adjustments. This was the currency she traded in. She had been working in the Moretti household for 22 days when Adrian Moretti walked into the kitchen at 4:47 in the morning and found her there. She hadn't expected anyone. The household didn't stir until 6. She'd come down early because her mother had called at midnight, one of those frightened, confused late-night calls that had been happening more frequently since the fall. And Celine had been awake ever since, lying in the staff quarters staring at the ceiling until the darkness started to feel like something pressing down on her chest. She'd come to the kitchen because movement helped, because the familiar rhythm of preparation, filling the kettle, measuring coffee, chopping the breakfast vegetables in exact uniform pieces, gave her hands something useful to do while her mind worked through things she couldn't fix. She was humming. She didn't realize it until she heard herself from the outside, the way you sometimes catch your own reflection unexpectedly. An old bolero her mother used to sing. She stopped the moment she heard the door. Adrian Moretti stood in the kitchen doorway in a white dress shirt with the sleeves pushed to his elbows, no jacket, no tie. He looked like he hadn't slept either. He was holding a phone loosely in one hand. He looked at her, at the cutting board, at the organized array of vegetables she had assembled, and then back at her. "You're early," he said. His voice was the same at 5 in the morning as it was at 7 in the evening, flat, measured, like a man who had trained every micro-expression into submission. "Couldn't sleep," she said. She didn't apologize for being there. It was her job to be there. She just happened to be there early. He was quiet for a moment. She kept her eyes on the cutting board and kept her knife moving, even though her pulse was doing something unfortunate and her grip had tightened slightly. This was not a man you wanted to startle. She knew that the way she knew which corners of her old neighborhood you walked through and which ones you walked around. "What are you making?" he asked. "Breakfast mise en place. For Dorota. Before Dorota gets here." "Yes." He watched her for a moment longer than was comfortable. She was aware of it without looking at him. The quality of his attention, the way it had weight. "You were humming something," he said. "Sorry." She wasn't particularly, but it was the correct social response. "I didn't say stop." A pause. "What was it?" She glanced up at him then, briefly. "Something my mother used to sing. Old Mexican ballad. I don't know the name of it." He nodded once, as if this answered something. Then he poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on the counter. Not asking, not explaining, because this was his house and he needed no permission for anything in it, and stood there at the counter and drank it while she worked. He stayed for 9 minutes. He said 4 more words total. Leave the garlic whole when she started to mince it, which she did, because he knew his own kitchen preferences better than she did, and she had no ego about being corrected. When he left, she let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Something had shifted. She couldn't have said what exactly. Only that the room felt different for a few minutes after he was gone. The way a space feels different after a significant piece of furniture has been moved. She went back to the garlic. Over the 2 weeks that followed, she became aware, the way prey animals are aware of observation, as a low-frequency vibration rather than a specific sight or sound, that Adrian Moretti was paying attention to her. Not in the way men sometimes pay attention to women in positions of domestic service, which she had dealt with before and had a specific set of responses to. This was different. Clinical, almost. Evaluating. She would be carrying a tray across the formal dining room and catch the particular quality of silence that meant someone was watching with genuine concentration rather than casual drift. She would be consulting with Dorota about the following week's schedule and realize, only after, that Adrian had been present in the doorway long enough to have heard most of it. She didn't adjust her behavior. There was nothing to adjust. She was doing her job, and her job was being done correctly. If he wanted to observe that, she had no objection. What she did not know, could not have known, was what he was actually seeing. He was watching her notice things that his professional security staff missed. He was watching her solve problems so quietly that the problems seemed to dissolve rather than get solved. He was watching her move through his household with the specific efficiency of someone who has never had the luxury of wasted motion. He was, for the first time in 15 years of running one of the most disciplined criminal organizations on the East Coast, finding himself genuinely surprised. Adrian Moretti did not like surprises, but he had trained himself, long ago, to pay attention to them. Then came the dinner that would change everything. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday. It was not phrased as an invitation. Men like Lucien Viscari didn't phrase things as invitations. He proposed gatherings the way a chess player proposes trades, with the specific confidence of someone who believes they have already calculated every possible response. Lucien was based in New York, ran his operations through 3 different boroughs and 2 cities in New Jersey, and had been testing the edges of Moretti territory for 14 months with the patience of a man who doesn't need to rush because he believes time is already working for him. The dinner was framed as diplomacy, a reset, an acknowledgement that 2 men of their respective positions had more to gain from strategic cooperation than from continued friction. Lucien's message, delivered through appropriate intermediaries, used words like mutual benefit and long-term stability and shared interests in the current climate. Celine was not privy to any of this negotiation. She was a waitress, but on the morning the preparations for the dinner began, the additional catering staff arriving, the formal dining room being set for 18, the specific wines being sourced and verified, she felt it. The things she had felt on her old block when the dynamic was about to turn. A vibration in the air that had no single source. A a collective tightness in how people moved and breathed and avoided meeting each other's eyes. By 2 in the afternoon, she had identified 3 things that didn't fit. The men Lucien's team had sent to assist with security walked the exits with too much interest. Not the casual sweep of professional protective detail, the focused attention of men memorizing routes. The senior catering staff Lucien had insisted on providing, a concession Adrian had accepted as a good faith gesture, moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of people who had been briefed on the layout in advance. And the dessert table, positioned at the far end of the ballroom, was placed in the one corner of the room with the worst sightline to the main doors and the best position relative to the service corridor that led to the back of the house. Celine stood in the kitchen doorway for 4 minutes, looking at the dessert table, doing math that had nothing to do with catering. Then she went to the cutlery station, selected a 7-inch kitchen knife with a worn black composite handle, wrapped it in a white linen napkin, and carried it across the ballroom without hurrying, without looking at anyone, without deviating from the path a woman setting up a service station would naturally walk. She put it under the dessert table, behind the tablecloth, against the back leg, where she could reach it without bending down significantly if she was standing at the right angle. She went back to the kitchen. She told no one, because who was she going to tell? She was the waitress. She had no proof of anything. Only the specific instinct of a woman who had spent her entire life reading predators before they revealed themselves, and the knowledge, bone deep, unargued, that something was going to happen tonight in that room, and that when it happened, every armed professional present was going to be a half-second behind, because every armed professional present was going to be watching the men with guns. Nobody ever watched the woman with the water pitcher. The guests began arriving at 7. Lucien Vescari walked through the front door at 7:14, flanked by 4 men who were paid to look like associates but moved like soldiers. He was 63 years old with silver hair, a charcoal suit, and the particular kind of charm that functions as camouflage. Expansive, warm, immediately personal in a way that made you feel chosen, noticed, valued, right up until the moment you understood that it was a technique and not a feeling, and that the man deploying it had the warmth of a closed fist. He shook Adrian's hand with both of his. Celine watched this from across the room while she filled water glasses, and the cold thing that had been sitting in her stomach all afternoon got colder and heavier. The dinner proceeded. 7 courses. Carefully sourced wine. Conversation that sounded, to anyone who didn't know how to listen, like 2 successful businessmen building a professional bridge. Laughter at the right moments. Compliments about the food. The specific theater of men who have decided, or appear to have decided, that cooperation serves them better than conflict. Celine moved through the room. She refilled. She cleared. She was furniture. She watched Lucien's men. She tracked the specific guard near the east door who had repositioned twice from where his principal was, which was wrong. Protective detail moves toward the principal under rising tension, not away. She tracked the catering man near the service corridor who had stopped actually catering 40 minutes into the dinner and was simply standing, waiting. She tracked the way the conversation at the main table had shifted in register. Smaller words, shorter sentences. The compressed language of people approaching a moment they've already rehearsed. It was almost time. She drifted toward the dessert table. She was standing there, adjusting a serving spoon that didn't need adjusting, when Lucien Vescari rose with his champagne glass and began speaking in the warm, generous tones of a man offering a toast. Celine's right hand dropped below the tablecloth. Her fingers found the knife handle. She watched the guard near the east wall. She watched him watch Lucien. She watched Lucien's left hand, the one not holding the champagne glass, drop slightly, fingers spreading in a gesture so small and so specific it could only mean one thing to the men who were waiting for it. The guard's right hand moved toward his jacket, and Celine was already moving. She didn't think. Thinking was too slow. She crossed 15 feet of ballroom in the time it took the guard to close his fingers on the weapon he was reaching for, and she came around Lucien Vescari's left side. The blind side. The side you don't cover because nobody expects the waitress. And her left arm locked across his chest, and her right hand brought the knife up against his throat with a precision that came from growing up where she grew up and working where she worked and spending 26 years learning exactly how much pressure communicates intent without drawing blood. The guard's weapon was halfway out. Every other weapon in the room was suddenly relevant. And Celine Hart, the invisible woman, The nobody said in a voice so flat and so certain that it cut through the silence like a second blade, "Tell your men to stop." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And in that suspended crystalline moment, with a knife at the most dangerous throat in the room, and every eye locked on her face, Celine became aware of exactly one thing. She could feel Lucien Viscari's pulse against the blade. It was fast. Good. What happened in the next 4 seconds would determine whether anyone in that room walked out alive. And the decision wasn't going to come from Adrian Moretti, or from Lucien's soldiers, or from Reyes and his men already shifting into position along the walls. It was going to come from her, and she had already made it. The first second was the longest second of Celine Hart's life. She could feel everything with a horrible, hyper-real clarity. The starch of Lucien Viscari's shirt collar against her forearm, the slight tremor in his chest that he was working very hard to suppress, the specific weight of the knife in her right hand, which was neither heavy nor light but simply present, an extension of a decision that could not be undecided. The ballroom smelled like expensive candles and roasted meat, and underneath both, something sharp and chemical that she recognized from her years working emergency intake, the smell of adrenaline leaving human bodies in quantity. 18 people in that room were armed. She was holding a kitchen knife. The math was not good, but math wasn't what mattered in that first second. What mattered was the freeze. She'd counted on it, built everything around it, the specific half-second of paralysis that hits even trained men when the situation diverges completely from every scenario they've rehearsed. Lucien's soldier near the east wall had his weapon halfway drawn, fingers wrapped around the grip, elbow cocked at the angle of a man who had practiced the motion 10,000 times. He was staring at her. His eyes were doing the calculation: distance, angle, probability of a clean shot without hitting his principal. And the calculation was taking longer than he wanted it to. She pressed the blade slightly firmer against Viscari's throat. Not enough to break skin. Enough to communicate that she understood exactly what she was doing. "I won't say it again," she said. Her voice surprised her. It came out low and level, stripped of everything except certainty. She'd heard her own voice crack under far lesser pressure. The third shift at the Englewood Clinic when the waiting room turned hostile. The night she'd had to call the police about the man outside her mother's building, and her hands shook so badly she'd missed Dale twice. But right now, with a knife at the throat of the most dangerous man in the room, her voice was the steadiest thing about her. Viscari spoke first. "Stand down." Barely above a whisper, directed at the room rather than at any specific man. The soldier's arm dropped, slowly, demonstratively. The weapon went back. Adrian's voice came from somewhere to her left. Controlled, immediate, already redirecting the machinery that had been caught flat-footed. "Reyes." That was all he said. One word. And then the room began to move in the organized, deliberate way of men who had been waiting for an order to exist. Not a specific order, but any order, some anchor point from which to act. Reyes's people moved toward the walls, toward Lucien's men, hands visible, weapons present but not drawn, occupying the specific geometry that says we have you without requiring anyone to pull a trigger. Lucien Viscari's breathing was measured in a way that had moved beyond deliberate into something almost meditative. He was a man who had been in genuinely dangerous situations before. She could feel it in how his body had organized itself under her arm, not rigid with shock, but arranged with the careful economy of someone riding out a physical threat rather than being destroyed by it. He was calculating. She could almost feel the calculations happening, like heat. "You're the waitress," he said quietly. There was no contempt in it, just the specific, focused attention of a man reassessing the terrain. "Yes," she said. "Put the knife down before someone does something that ends badly for everyone." "That's what I'm trying to prevent." A silence. His men were being separated from their weapons now, Reyes's people working through the room with professional efficiency, while Adrian stood at the head of the table and watched with an expression she couldn't see from where she was standing, but could feel the weight of. "Your man near the east door," she said. "He was going to shoot Mr. Moretti during the toast. The signal was your left hand." Viscari said nothing. "The catering supervisor you provided has been standing in front of the service corridor for 41 minutes without actually doing anything. That corridor leads to the back of the house and out to the east gate, which your advance team checked twice this afternoon." She kept her voice at the same flat register. You weren't here for diplomacy. You're a waitress, he said again, differently this time. I'm aware. Adrian spoke from across the room. Celine. She looked up without loosening her hold. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, and she'd spent 30 days watching that face the way you watch weather, reading it for information that might affect your survival. The expression wasn't gratitude. It wasn't quite shock. It was something more unsettling than either of those things. It was the look of a man who has just discovered that his model of the world was incomplete in a significant way, and who is both disturbed by this and, somewhere beneath the disturbance, riveted. Let him go, Adrian said. She evaluated that for a half second, then she stepped back. The knife came away clean. Her arm dropped. Lucien Viscari adjusted his collar. He turned to look at her, and for a moment the two of them were face to face. The 63-year-old man who ran a criminal empire across 3 states, and the 26-year-old woman in a black service uniform who had just dismantled his carefully constructed ambush with a kitchen knife in 22 days of paying attention. He studied her face. She let him. Interesting, he said. Then he turned away from her toward Adrian, and the room's atmosphere shifted completely into something colder and more formal. The disarmed violence in the room hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply reorganized itself. Whatever happened next was above her pay grade. She set the knife on the dessert table, retrieved her water pitcher from where she'd left it on the service stand, and went back to work. That was how Celine Hart handled the end of the most dangerous moment of her life. She went back to filling water glasses. She was on her 3rd glass when her hands started shaking. She put the pitcher down and pressed both palms flat against the service table until the shaking stopped. 30 seconds. Maybe 40. Then she picked up the pitcher and kept going, because there was nothing else to do and because showing weakness in this particular room at this particular moment felt like a choice with consequences she didn't want to explore. Lucien's people were escorted from the premises within the hour. The dinner ended with neither ceremony nor explanation. The guests, who were Adrian's legitimate business associates, were seen to their cars with the kind of smooth, apologetic efficiency that communicates technical difficulties without specifying what those difficulties were. The catering staff Lucien had provided were held in a secondary room until Reyes determined what to do with them. The soldier from the east wall sat in a chair in the kitchen with 2 men standing behind him and said absolutely nothing to anyone. Celine washed dishes. She washed dishes for 45 minutes while the house rearranged itself around her, because there were dishes and they needed washing, and she needed something physical to do with her hands. The hot water helped with the residual shaking. The repetitive motion helped with the part of her brain that kept replaying the texture of the knife handle, the weight of another person's life against her arm. She was drying a crystal wine glass when Reyes appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her for a long moment. "Mr. Moretti wants to see you," he said. She set the glass down. Adrian's private study was on the 2nd floor, a room she had cleaned but never occupied, a room that communicated a great deal about the man who used it without trying to communicate anything at all. Walls of books that looked genuinely read. A desk that was organized the way a working surface is organized, not the way a display surface is organized. No art on the walls except a single photograph. A landscape, somewhere cold and northern, no people in it. He was standing at the window when she came in, not looking out of it, standing with his back to the glass, arms crossed loosely, watching the door. He waited until Reyes closed it behind her. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine standing." Something shifted in his expression. Not annoyance, closer to adjustment, a recalibration of expectation. He nodded once, almost to himself. "Who are you?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. It came out like something he was thinking through aloud. "I'm your waitress," she said. "Don't do that." She held his eyes. "What do you want to know?" "Everything." He uncrossed his arms and moved toward the desk, not sitting, just occupying the space differently. "Start with the knife. How long before the dinner did you put it there?" 40 minutes. "Why that corner?" It was the only position in the room with a blind angle to the main security coverage and direct access to Viscari's left side. He's right-handed. His protective instinct runs right. I needed to come from the left. Adrian was quiet for a moment that felt specifically weighted, the way the air gets heavy before weather. "You planned that in advance," he said. "I planned for the possibility." Based on what? The way his men walked the exits, the catering staff he sent. They knew the layout before they arrived. And the dessert table placement. Nobody puts a service station in that corner by accident. It was chosen. She paused. I've worked in enough rooms to know when a room has been arranged for something other than its stated purpose. He looked at her with that specific quality of attention again, the one she'd been aware of for 2 weeks without fully understanding what it meant. You've been watching my security operations, he said. I've been watching everything, she said. It's how I work. It's how I've always worked. The wine steward, 3 weeks ago. Yes. The delivery driver on your 6th day. Yes. He sat down then, slowly, in the chair behind the desk, as if the weight of what he was recalculating required a different physical orientation. Why didn't you come to me directly? He said. You're the employer. I'm the staff. I told Dorota and Reyes when I had something concrete. Tonight I didn't have time to tell anyone. You could have told Reyes about your suspicions this afternoon, before the dinner. I could have, she agreed, and he would have told me I was a waitress. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man who knows an accurate thing has been said and is taking a moment to decide what to do with that accuracy. The scar on your arm, he said. She had been waiting for this. That's not your business, she said. The temperature in the room changed, not dramatically, subtly. The way a room changes when someone who is accustomed to being answered a certain way encounters something different. You're in my house, he said. Quiet. Exact. I'm aware. The scar is still not your business. She held the eye contact. Not tonight. Another pause, longer. All right, he said. That was unexpected enough that she felt it. A small, physical surprise in her chest, like a step she'd anticipated that wasn't there. He looked down at the desk surface, then back at her. Is there anything else I should know about tonight? About the dinner? About Viscari's people? About anything you observed that hasn't been addressed? She thought for a moment. Genuine thought, not performance. The man you have in the kitchen. The soldier from the east wall. He's going to tell you he was just following Viscari's orders and that he doesn't know anything else. She paused. He's lying. He knows considerably more. He was watching your security rotation for the past hour before the dinner, not watching it the way bodyguards watch a new environment, watching it the way someone watches a thing they've been watching for a while. He's been in this house before. Adrian's expression didn't change. How long ago? He said. I don't know. But the kitchen layout didn't surprise him. He moved through it during the setup without any of the small hesitations people have in unfamiliar spaces. Adrian picked up his phone from the desk. He made a short call. 2 sentences, no names, no explanation. Then he set it back down. Thank you, he said. She was so startled by this that she almost said you're welcome before catching herself. Is that all? She said instead. For tonight. He looked at her again, and she had the uncomfortable sense that she was being memorized. Not in any way that felt predatory, in the way that something important gets memorized, the way you commit something to memory because you've assessed it as something you'll need to have access to later. Go get some sleep. She left. She didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the staff quarters and looked at her hands in the dark until they stopped feeling like they belonged to someone else. And then she lay down and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the house reorganizing itself around the aftermath of what had almost happened. And she thought about her mother and the bolero and the way the knife had felt in her hand. Not wrong. And that was what disturbed her, the fact that it hadn't felt wrong at all, just necessary. The morning came gray and cold and without ceremony. She went to the kitchen. She made coffee. The ratio was right. The timing was right. She was arranging the breakfast mise en place when Reyes appeared, which surprised her because Reyes did not normally appear in the kitchen before 7. We need to talk, he said. She kept her hands moving. About what? About last night. He came further into the kitchen, not leaning against anything, standing in the center of the floor with his arms at his sides in the way of a man who is uncomfortable with what he's about to say and has decided the way through it is directness. You made my people look bad. She looked at him. I noticed something and I acted on it, she said. Your people were covering the room, which is what they were supposed to be doing. We didn't see the knife placement. No. We didn't flag the catering supervisor. No. We didn't catch the soldier's prior knowledge of the layout. No. He was quiet. She could see the specific discomfort of professional pride meeting uncomfortable fact, and she had enough experience with how men in Reyes's position handled that particular discomfort to know to keep her face neutral and wait. What I'm trying to say, he said, is that we need to understand how you're doing what you're doing so that we can... He stopped. So that you can integrate it into your operation. Yes. She turned back to the cutting board. I watch, she said. I've always watched. I grew up in Englewood, Mr. Reyes. You learn to watch or you don't make it to 26. You worked medical. She looked at him again, sharply this time. Mr. Moretti had your background checked this morning, he said, without apology. She waited for the anger. It came, but it was lower grade than she expected, duller, more tired. She'd known this was coming. Some version of this was always coming. Emergency Intake Clinic, Southside Community 2019 to 2022, she said. 3 years, night shifts, mostly. That's where the scar's from. She set the knife down on the cutting board and turned fully to face him. Tell Mr. Moretti, she said, that if he has questions about my past, he can ask me himself. And he can do it the way he asked about everything else last night, by actually asking instead of pulling files. Reyes held her gaze. There was something in his expression that she couldn't fully read. Not quite respect, not quite assessment. Something in the middle. I'll tell him, he said. He left. She picked up the knife and went back to work. Adrian did not come to the kitchen that morning. He appeared at the breakfast table at 7:45, precisely when he always appeared, and he ate what she brought without comment, and the household moved through the morning in its usual rhythms as though the previous night had been incorporated into the routine rather than shattering it. But things were different. She could feel it in the small adjustments, the way Reyes's people looked at her differently when she moved through a room, not hostile, something more complex than that. The way the junior staff had picked up, with the uncanny social accuracy of people whose survival depends on reading shifts in the household's power structure, that something had changed in Celine Hart's position within that structure. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. 4 days passed. On the 5th day, Lucien Viscari called. She didn't know about the call when it happened. She found out because she was carrying a tray past Adrian's study, and the door wasn't fully closed, and she heard his voice. Not the content, just the register. Controlled, but compressed. The voice of a man receiving information that he is choosing, carefully, not to react to. She kept walking. She found out what the call contained at dinner that evening, not because anyone told her, but because Adrian came to the dining room with a particular quality of tension around his jaw, the kind that comes not from one thing said in a meeting, but from a decision being sat with. And because Reyes spent the meal station near the east window, rather than his usual position near the door, which told her the threat assessment had shifted. She cleared the second course. Adrian looked at her as she was moving away from the table. Celine. She stopped. The 2 other men at the table, quiet, watchful men whose names she'd never been given, both looked at her and then, with the specific courtesy of professionals, looked away. Sit down, Adrian said. She sat, the chair across from him. He waited until the other 2 men had left the room, which they did without being asked, which told her something about how often this kind of conversation happened and how smoothly the household accommodated it. Viscari called this afternoon, he said. I assumed. A small pause. You assumed? Your jaw does a specific thing when you've been threatened and you're deciding whether to let it show, she said. It's been doing it since dinner started. He looked at her with that unreadable expression. He threatened my mother, she said. Not a question. The silence confirmed it. Something cold and specific moved through her chest. Not panic, not surprise even. She had calculated this possibility. Had known since the night in the ballroom that intervention had a price, and that Lucien Viscari was not the kind of man to absorb a humiliation without finding the softest target available and pressing on it. Her mother was 61 years old, partially paralyzed from a stroke 18 months ago, living alone in a 3rd-floor apartment in Pilsen with 2 window locks and a door chain that Celine checked every time she visited. She kept her face still. What did he say exactly? She said. That the woman who put a knife to his throat should consider the people who depend on her. Adrian's voice was careful, precise, delivering the message without the editorial that would complicate whatever response she gave. He mentioned Pilsen. She breathed in through her nose. Out. I need to call her, she said. I've already sent 2 men to the building. She looked at him. They're good, he said. She won't know they're there unless she needs to know. Something cracked, very slightly, in the wall she had been maintaining since the knife came down. She patched it quickly, but he was watching closely enough that she thought he might have seen the moment. Why? She said. Why what? Why did you do that before telling me? He held her eyes. Because I knew if I told you first, you'd try to handle it yourself. And the men I sent are better equipped for this particular kind of handling than you are. A pause. No offense intended. None taken. She looked at the table's surface. That's accurate. I need to know about the clinic, he said. About the scar. She looked up. Not from a file, he said. From you. Because whatever happened to you, it's part of why you see what you see. And I need to understand what I'm working with. She almost said working with and decided not to. She thought about the bolero, about her mother's voice, thin and slightly off-key, filling a small kitchen in Inglewood on Sunday mornings. About 3 years of night shifts in an emergency intake clinic that served a neighborhood where Tuesday nights sometimes felt like war zones, where she'd learned to triage not just physical wounds but intentions, to read the room so fast and so accurately that it stopped feeling like a skill and started feeling like a reflex. She thought about the night the scar happened. It was 2021, she said. Night shift. A man came in who was... She stopped, chose the right words. He was in crisis. He had a straight razor. He didn't come in to hurt anyone. He came in because he had nowhere else to go, and he was trying to hold something together that was already gone. She looked at her forearm where the sleeve covered the diagonal line. I was the one who talked to him. I was good at that, talking people down. I'd done it 30, 40 times. But this one, she stopped again. He wasn't angry at me. His hand moved wrong and I was too close and I didn't move fast enough. She said this the way you say things that have been processed so many times, they've been reduced to their essential structure, stripped of most of the attached feeling through sheer repetition of telling. I left the clinic 8 months later, she said, not because of the scar, because of what it cost doing that work. What it costs to be the person who notices everything and absorbs everything and keeps other people from seeing how much weight that is. She looked at him directly. You wanted to know. That's what happened. Adrian Moretti sat with this for a moment. He didn't offer anything easy. No, I'm sorry, no reflexive sympathy. He just held the information with the same seriousness with which it had been given, and she found that unexpectedly more difficult to handle than comfort would have been. The man Reyes has in custody, he said finally. The soldier from the east wall. He confirmed what you said. He's been inside this house before, twice in the last 3 months. A pause that had weather in it. During periods when our internal schedule was being relayed externally. She understood what he was saying. You have an informant, she said. I had one, he said. Past tense as of this afternoon. Who? One of my captains, junior, ambitious. The words were flat. She did not ask what past tense meant in this specific context, and he did not elaborate. But then he said something she wasn't expecting. There may be a second one, he said. Someone closer. She looked at him. I don't have a name, he said. I have a pattern, certain information that could only have come from inside this specific operation. Information that the junior captain didn't have access to. He looked at her, and the quality of the look had shifted into something very careful. I'm going to need your eyes. You have Reyes, she said. Reyes is excellent at what he does, but he operates inside the structure. He stopped, chose. Furniture, she said. Something moved across his face that might, in a different light, in a different man, have been the beginning of something that looked like it hurt. I was going to say outside the structure, he said. She held his eyes for a long moment. She thought about her mother in the Pilsen apartment. She thought about the 2 men Adrian had sent without being asked, without conditions, because someone had threatened a woman who couldn't protect herself, and he had responded to that before he'd done anything else. She thought about what it would mean to say yes, what it would cost. what the structure of her life looked like now versus what it had looked like 5 days ago, and whether the distance between those two versions of her life could be measured anymore in any unit she recognized. "What does closer mean?" she said. "When you say someone closer." He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on any face quite like that. Not fear, not exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that a man who has spent 15 years being the most dangerous person in every room might feel when he begins to suspect that the danger has moved inside and that he does not yet know which face it's wearing. "It means," he said slowly, "that I may not be able to trust everyone in this house." The silence stretched, and then from somewhere in the east wing, muffled, barely audible, but distinct to anyone trained to notice sounds that don't belong, came the specific sound of a door that should have been locked. The sound came again. Celine was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand, the chair scraping back against the hardwood with a sound that was too loud in the compressed silence of Adrian's study. He was already moving, not toward the door, toward the desk, the bottom right drawer, and she noted this without surprise because a man who has survived 15 years in his particular profession does not sit in a room without knowing exactly where the nearest weapon is. He had a gun in his hand by the time she reached the door. "Stay here," he said. She ignored him and opened the door. The East Wing corridor was dim. The house ran on reduced lighting after 10, an energy protocol that had felt merely practical until this exact moment when the half-darkness turned every doorway into a problem. Celine stood in the corridor entrance and listened with her entire body, not just her ears. The way she'd learned in Englewood when listening wrong could mean walking into something that couldn't be unwound. The sound had come from the third door on the left, the small room that functioned as a secondary communications hub, equipment, monitors, the routing system for the household's internal security network. Adrian came up behind her. She could feel him without turning around, the specific displacement of air that a person makes when they are moving with intentional quietness, which is different from the displacement of ordinary movement. "That room should be empty," he said, very low. "I know." "Reyes has the only key." She looked at the door. The gap at the bottom showed no light. She said, "Does Reyes know that only Reyes has the key?" A pause that lasted exactly as long as it took Adrian to understand the specific architecture of what she was asking. Then she heard him breathe out through his nose, a single controlled exhale that communicated more than most men's full sentences. He moved past her. He did not knock. He hit the door at the lock plate with the heel of his hand, a specific, practiced motion. And the door swung inward hard, and Adrian went in behind it with the gun up, and Celine came in behind him, staying low and left, out of his line of fire. The room was empty, or it appeared empty for approximately 3 seconds, which is how long it took for her eyes to adjust and to identify the specific wrongness that the darkness was hiding. The monitor screens on the west wall were dark, which was normal. The equipment rack was intact. The routing panel in the corner was the panel, she said. Adrian's flashlight hit it. The routing panel was a standard-issue security network hub, 12 ports, each one corresponding to a different sector of the household's camera and sensor network. All 12 ports should have had solid green indicator lights, meaning active and recording. 10 of them were green. 2 were dark. She crossed the room and crouched in front of the panel. The 2 dark ports corresponded to the sectors she identified from the small label strips below each one, and when she read the labels, her stomach did something cold and specific. East Gate and the staff quarters corridor. Someone killed the recording on those 2 sectors, she said. Not the cameras, just the recording. The cameras are still transmitting, the signal's just not being logged. She looked at the panel more carefully. This was done from inside the panel, not remotely. Someone was in this room within the last... She checked the small digital clock on the equipment rack. Within the last 20 minutes. Adrian was looking at the door. The door was locked, he said. Yes. Reyes has the only key. You said that. He pulled out his phone. She heard it ring twice before Reyes picked up, and then Adrian said, "Where are you right now?" And listened, and his jaw did the thing she'd described at dinner. The compressed tension, the controlled reaction. "Come to the communications room," he said. "Now." He hung up. They waited. Celine stayed crouched in front of the panel, not touching anything, just looking at the configuration of what had been altered and doing the slow arithmetic of what it meant and who it benefited, and when the decision to alter it would have been made. 20 minutes ago. 20 minutes ago, she and Adrian had been in the study, having a conversation that, through a closed door, would have been inaudible, but a conversation that anyone watching the study from the Eastgate camera feed could have known was happening. Could have known was an extended private conversation, the kind that occupied both participants fully, the kind that gave someone 20 minutes to do something unobserved in a corridor that was no longer being recorded. Reyes appeared in the doorway. He looked at Adrian, he looked at Celine, he looked at the panel. "Who else has a key to this room?" Adrian said. Reyes looked at the door, the specific look of a man examining something and simultaneously examining what it means that he's examining it. "No one," he said. "That's not an answer that fits the current evidence. I understand that." Reyes came into the room and crouched beside Celine without asking her to move, studying the panel with the focused attention of a professional who is deeply unhappy with what he's seeing. "The key doesn't leave my person. I checked the room at 8:15. Everything was operational." "These two ports were killed in the last 20 minutes, Celine said. "Eastgate and Staff Corridor." Reyes looked at her. Back at the panel. "Someone has a copy," he said. Not as an excuse. As a statement of mechanical fact, the way a technician identifies a system failure. Or, Celine said, someone has had access to the key long enough to copy it at some point in the past. Could have been weeks ago. Could have been months. The three of them sat with this. "The staff quarters corridor," Adrian said. Celine stood up. "My room is on the staff quarters corridor." The silence that followed had the texture of something being confirmed rather than something being newly suspected. She walked past both of them, out the door, down the corridor. She heard Adrian behind her. She heard Reyes behind Adrian. She counted steps the way she always counted steps, not consciously, just as information her body gathered automatically, mapping distance and time against what she knew about the space. Her room was the fourth door on the left. The door was closed. She didn't remember closing it. She was nearly certain she had left it open, the way she always left it. The staff quarters had no cross-ventilation, and a closed door made the space stifling, and she'd lived too long in too many airless rooms to voluntarily add to it. She pushed the door open with 2 fingers. The room was small. Single bed, narrow wardrobe, the kind of window that provides light but not much of a view. She'd kept it spare, the way she kept everything, because accumulation required a certainty about the future that she'd never quite managed to feel. The wardrobe door was open 3 inches. She always kept it fully closed. She crossed the room in 5 steps and opened the wardrobe completely. Her clothes were there. The 2 pairs of slacks, the 3 service blouses, the civilian clothes she wore on her off hours. Everything appeared untouched. She went through it quickly, methodically, hands checking pockets and seams and the interior bottom of the wardrobe where she kept a small fireproof box containing her mother's medical documents, her own identification, and $1,100 in cash that represented 4 months of careful saving. The box was there, was unlocked. She always kept it locked. She opened it. The documents were there. The cash was there. But the documents were in a different order than she'd arranged them. Her mother's discharge paperwork on top instead of her own identification, which she always kept on the outside because she might need it quickly. Someone had gone through these papers, carefully enough to put them back. Not carefully enough to remember the exact sequence. She closed the box and set it on the bed and stood there with her hands loose at her sides and breathed, because the alternative to breathing was something she couldn't afford right now. Adrian had followed her in. He was standing in the doorway, not crossing the threshold without permission, which she noticed, which she filed away. "Someone went through my things," she said. "Looking for what? I don't know." She picked up the box. "My personal documents. Cash. Nothing's missing." She turned to face him. "Which means they weren't looking for something to take. They were looking for something to understand." "Who you are," he said. "Who I am. Where I came from. Whether the background check tells the complete story." She looked at the wardrobe. Someone in this house doesn't trust what Reyes's investigation turned up. Someone wanted to check for themselves. "Or confirm something they already suspected," Adrian said. She looked at him sharply. His face was doing something complicated, not Not closed off, not exactly, but the kind of careful that you deploy when you're managing information you haven't finished organizing. She knew that look. She'd been seeing it on the faces of people who knew things she didn't for most of her life. "What do you know?" she said. "I don't know anything yet. I have—" "Don't." She cut him off. Quietly, but firmly enough that he stopped. "Don't tell me you have a theory while someone is going through my room and killing camera feeds. That's the point where the information stops being theoretical." He held her eyes. "Tell me what you know," she said. A long pause. The kind that has a decision in it. "The informant I dealt with this afternoon," he said. "The junior captain. Before we finished our conversation, he gave me a name, someone he claimed had been the initial contact, the person who recruited him to pass information to Viscari." Adrian paused. "He claimed it was someone inside my security operation." "Reyes," she said. "No." And then, after a beat, "Someone who works closely with Reyes." She did the math in about 2 seconds. There were 4 people in Adrian's household who worked closely with Reyes at the operational level. His second, a man named Carver. The head of external security, a man named Walsh. The internal surveillance officer. And the household's personal driver, who doubled as Adrian's close protection when he was off property. "Which one?" she said. The informant said he never met the person directly. Everything was passed through cutouts. But he described a specific detail. Adrian stopped. Chose words. A detail about how the person communicated. A phrase they always used at the end of correspondence to confirm authenticity. "What phrase?" "The house knows." Celine stood very still. She had heard that phrase once, 8 days ago, in the kitchen. The internal surveillance officer, a man named Garrett, 34 years old, wire-rimmed glasses, the specific manner of someone who has spent years in a room full of monitors and has adjusted his social presentation accordingly, had been speaking to one of the junior staff about a scheduling change. He'd ended the exchange with it, casually, the way you use a verbal tic that's become so habitual you no longer hear yourself saying it. "The house knows." She had noted it at the time as a slightly odd turn of phrase. Filed it away. Not attributed it to anything. She told Adrian. He listened without moving. When she finished, he turned and walked out of the room. She followed. Reyes was in the corridor, and Adrian said one thing to him, the surveillance officer's name, and Reyes's face went through several rapid changes before settling into the controlled blankness of a professional receiving intelligence that is both credible and deeply unwelcome. "He's on shift," Reyes said. "Monitoring room." "Don't move until I say," Adrian said. He went back toward his study. Celine followed, not because she'd been invited, but because she had stopped waiting for invitations approximately 48 hours ago, and neither of them had addressed this directly, which she took as a working agreement. In the study, Adrian made 3 phone calls in 11 minutes. Short calls, no preamble. The compressed shorthand of a man operating an organization that has developed its own internal language over 15 years. She sat in the chair across from his desk and listened to the shape of the conversations without being able to hear the content, reading register and rhythm the way she always read things, for what the music told her about the lyrics. The third call lasted longer. His voice dropped on the third call, and his face did something she hadn't seen before. Not the compressed tension of threat management, something rawer than that. Something that lived beneath the professional surface. When he hung up, he was quiet for almost a full minute. "Garrett has been active for 14 months, he said. Not 3, not 6. 14. He set the phone down with the deliberate care of a man controlling the force he applies to things. The schedules he's been leaking, the security rotations, the routes. A pause. The dinner last week wasn't Vescari's first attempt. There was a situation in February that I attributed to a different source. He looked at the phone. It wasn't a different source. "February?" she said. And then, because the timeline was doing something in her head. "When in February?" "The 14th. A car—" He stopped. "A car accident," she said. It wasn't quite a question. He looked at her. "There was a report in the household logs," she said. "I saw it when Dorota was updating the maintenance records. A vehicle incident on the 14th of February. The logs said ice on the road." She kept her voice level. "Was it ice on the road?" The pause was its own answer. "No," he said. She sat with this. 14 months. Garrett had been inside Adrian's operation for 14 months, feeding information to Lucian Vescari and the dinner last week. The champagne toast, the East Wall soldier, the knife against a throat. That had been the fourth attempt. Not the first, not even the second. And Adrian had nearly died 3 times already without knowing why the attempts felt like they came from inside the walls. Because they did. "You need to bring him in now," she said. "I need to know what he knows first. Who else he's spoken to. The full chain." Adrian stood up. "If I move on him without understanding the chain, the rest of it goes to ground, and I spend the next year watching my back and not knowing where the next thing comes from. If you wait, he destroys whatever he hasn't already destroyed." "I know. The camera reports he killed tonight. I know. As he knows you're getting close to something, the camera reports weren't random. They were Celine." He said her name sharply enough to stop her, then more quietly. "I know. I've been doing this for 15 years. I know what the signs mean." He looked at her. "What I don't know is why he killed your corridor specifically. Why your room?" She'd been sitting with that question since the wardrobe. "Because someone told him to check me," she said slowly. "Before the dinner, I was invisible. After the dinner, I'm not. I did something that changed the calculus. Vescari had to report back that his plan failed, and he had to explain why, and the explanation involved a waitress he'd never heard of. So Vescari asks his contact inside the house, 'Who is this woman?' And the contact goes to find out. What would he have found? A background that checks out completely, nothing actionable." She paused. "Unless he was looking for leverage." The word sat between them. "Your mother," Adrian said. "Vescari already has Pilsen. That's not new information from tonight." She thought. Unless Garrett found something else. Something in the documents that... She stopped. Her mind had caught on something, a snag in the fabric of the timeline. "The medical documents," she said. My mother's discharge paperwork." She stood up. "Her medication schedule is in those documents," she said. "Her pharmacy, her home care routine, her weekly appointment times." She looked at the door. If Garrett photographed those documents and passed them on, Vescari doesn't just know my mother is in Pilsen. He knows exactly where she is and when she'll be alone and what her daily pattern looks like. The air in the room changed. She was already at the door. "The men you sent to the building," she said. "Can you reach them right now?" Adrian had the phone up. She heard it ring, heard the pickup, heard him say a name and then say, "Status check. Right now, do a visual on the building entrance and report back in 60 seconds. They both stood and waited for 60 seconds. It was the longest 60 seconds she could remember experiencing, longer than the first second in the ballroom, longer than the 3 years of night shifts, longer than the 18 months since her mother's stroke, when she'd stood in a hospital corridor and been told by a doctor who was kind but not gentle that the recovery would be significant and the timeline was uncertain and the costs were going to require planning. The call came back. She watched Adrian's face. She saw the exact moment the information arrived. She saw what it did to his expression, not the compressed professional tension she was familiar with, something else, something human and ugly that he didn't have time to manage before she saw it. "What?" she said. He lowered the phone. "The 2 men I sent," he said. "They're not responding to visual check. The building entrance is clear, but..." He stopped. Something moved across his jaw. "There's a vehicle parked at the East Alley. It wasn't there at the last check-in." She was moving toward the door before he finished the sentence. He caught her arm, not rough, but firm. The grip of a man who needs something to stop and is willing to be the thing that stops it. "You cannot go there like this," he said. "Let go of my arm. Listen to me. She's 61 years old and she can't walk without a..." Her voice cracked on the last word and she stopped and hated herself for stopping and hated the crack in her voice and hated the specific powerlessness of being 40 minutes from her mother's building while a strange car sat in the East Alley. "I have people closer than we are," Adrian said. His voice had changed. Not softer exactly, but stripped of the professional management, talking to her directly without the intermediary layer. "I can have someone at that building in 4 minutes. Someone good. But I need 30 seconds to make the call, and I need you to stand still for 30 seconds. She stopped. She looked at her own reflection in the dark window glass. Hazel eyes, the color of creek water, and something behind them that she'd been carrying for so long she'd stopped recognizing it as weight. 30 seconds, she said. He made the call. It took 22 seconds. When he lowered the phone, he said, "Manny's team is 2 blocks east. They're moving now." He looked at her. 4 minutes. She counted. She stood in the middle of Adrian Moretti's study and counted 4 minutes in her head while he stood on the other side of the desk and did not tell her it was going to be fine, which was the only thing she could have said that she would have been grateful for, because the alternative was a comforting lie, and she had never been able to accept those gracefully, and he seemed, against all probability, to understand this. 3 minutes and 40 seconds in, his phone rang. He listened. He said, "Thank you." He lowered the phone. "She's okay," he said. "The vehicle was connected to Vescari. 2 men. They've been detained. Your mother is fine. She's awake, she's asking questions, and according to Manny, she's apparently arguing with him about whether she needs help she didn't ask for." A pause. "She sounds like she might be related to you." Celine sat down on the edge of the nearest chair. She put both hands flat on her knees and pressed down hard, and breathed. She had been carrying something for the last 8 minutes that she did not have a name for, and now that it was being set down, it turned out to have been extremely heavy, and the setting down of it hit her in the body before it hit her in the mind, a wave of something that started in her chest and moved outward through her arms, and she sat there and breathed through it and did not cry, because she was in Adrian Moretti's study, and she was not going to cry in Adrian Moretti's study. He gave her the time she needed. He did not watch her overtly. He moved to the window, putting his back to her, giving her the privacy of his inattention, which was a more sophisticated form of courtesy than she would have predicted from him 3 weeks ago. When she had herself back, she said, "We need to move on Garrett tonight." "Yes," he said, before he realizes the Pilsen attempt failed and destroys what he can. "Yes, and Adrian." She used his first name. She'd never used it before. She heard it land in the space between them with a slight weight that acknowledged itself. "When we bring him in, I want to be there." He turned from the window. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize. Not the professional assessment, not the management. The one underneath all of that. The one that appeared rarely and briefly, and which she suspected not many people had ever seen. "All right," he said. They found Garrett in the monitoring room at 11:47. He was sitting in front of the screens with a coffee mug and the specific posture of a man who believes himself unwatched, which is a different posture than the one you carry when you know the cameras are on you. Reyes's people were already in position outside the 2 exits. She knew this without seeing it, could infer it from the way Reyes moved ahead of them down the corridor with the compressed efficiency of a man executing a plan that has been communicated and received. Garrett heard them coming. She saw it in the half-second before the door opened. The specific adjustment of a body that has registered threat, the shoulders squaring in a way that was almost identical to how the wine steward's hands had gone too still at the dinner last week. The telltale overcorrection of someone trying to appear normal and trying too hard. The door opened. Garrett looked at Adrian. He looked at Reyes. He looked at Celine. And something in his face, when his eyes landed on her, something that told her everything she needed to know about the nature of the intelligence he'd been building on her, the specific quality of the look, which was not surprise and was not fear, but was the cold, evaluating look of a man who has been building a picture and is now seeing the subject of that picture standing in front of him, uncontained. 14 months, Adrian said. Garrett's face closed down. "I don't know what—" "Don't." Adrian's voice was quiet. So quiet she almost had to lean forward to hear it. "We're past the part where that response does you any good." Garrett looked at Reyes, looking for something. Alliance, intervention, some fracture in the room's unified position that he could work. He found nothing. He looked back at Adrian. "What do you want to know?" he said. "Everything," Adrian said. "Starting with who else?" A silence. "There's no one else," Garrett said. Celine watched his eyes when he said it. She watched the specific direction they moved, left and slightly down. The micro-movement of a person accessing constructed narrative rather than retrieved memory. She'd seen it in the intake clinic. She'd seen it in the ballroom. She'd been watching faces her entire life, and she knew what that movement meant as well as she knew her own name. "He's lying," she said. Garrett looked at her, fast, sharp. There's someone else, she said. Someone you haven't named. Someone you're more afraid of than you are of what happens to you in this room. Garrett's jaw tightened. Who is it? She said. He said nothing. She pulled a chair from against the wall and set it in front of him and sat down in it, close enough that he would have to look at her, or look away. And she held his eyes with the same flat certainty she'd used in the ballroom, and said, very quietly, I grew up in Englewood. I worked 3 years in an emergency intake clinic on the South Side. I have been the person in the room that nobody looks at my entire life, and I have been watching you for 3 weeks, and I can promise you that I know things about what you've been doing in this house that you don't know, I know. So you can choose to be more afraid of whoever you're protecting than you are of me and of what's in this room. Or you can understand that the person you're protecting already sent 2 men to a 61-year-old woman's apartment tonight and is not going to protect you back. Reach plus. Osem. Garrett stared at her. His jaw worked. She waited. And then he said a name that made Reyes go completely still and made Adrian close his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. And when Adrian opened them again, something had changed in his face that she had never seen there before and hoped never to see again. The specific expression of a man who has just discovered that the betrayal is not peripheral but structural, not a soldier but someone woven into the foundation, and that the thing he's been building his life on has been compromised at a level that will require dismantling before it can be rebuilt, and that there is no version of what comes next that doesn't cost something he cannot get back. The name Garrett had said was not a junior captain's name. It was not a soldier's name. It was the name of a man who had been in Adrian's operation since the beginning. Not 14 months, not 3 years, but 15 years since the first year, since before the mansion and the legitimate businesses and the careful construction of everything that looked, from the outside, like an empire built on discipline and intelligence, and the refusal to trust easily. It was the name of the man who had taught Adrian in those first years how to build something that couldn't be taken apart. And that man, it now appeared, had spent the last 14 months helping Viscari find the seams. Celine sat in the chair and watched Adrian Moretti absorb this, and she thought about what she'd said to him. True strength is not measured by what you've built, but by what you do when you discover that someone has been unbuilding it from inside. She hadn't said that to him, not in those words. But sitting in that room, watching his face, she understood for the first time that this was what she'd been circling toward since the knife went against Viscari's throat. Not the ballroom moment, not the dramatic gesture, but this one. This quieter and more devastating moment, because anyone can hold a knife, but not everyone can sit across from the proof that the thing they've trusted most has been the thing working hardest against them and remain standing. Adrian opened his eyes. He looked at her. She nodded once. He turned to Reyes. Get the car, he said. We're going to need to have a different conversation than the one I planned for tonight. And Reyes said, yes, and moved, and the room began organizing itself around a new and more dangerous purpose. And Celine stood up from the chair and understood, in the particular way that people understand things that cannot be taken back, that she was no longer the waitress, had not been the waitress since the knife came up, and that whatever she was now, whatever word applied to the woman standing in a surveillance room at midnight while the architecture of a criminal empire was being revealed as compromised from its foundation, that word was going to require her to become something she had never planned on being and could not now choose not to become. The door to the monitoring room was still open. Somewhere in the east wing, a phone began to ring. Nobody moved to answer it, because they all understood in that suspended and terrible moment that the call was not for any of them. It was the signal going out, the warning being sent, the moment at which whoever was on the other end of Garrett's loyalty chain realized that the chain had been cut, and that everything was about to move faster than any plan they had made could account for, and that the woman who had started all of this with a kitchen knife and 22 days of paying attention was now standing at the center of something that had no clean edges and no guaranteed exits and no version of resolution that didn't require walking directly into the dark. The phone rang 4 times. Then it stopped. And the silence that followed was the silence of something beginning that could not be stopped. The name Garrett had given them was Daniel Voss. Celine didn't know the name. She knew the face. A man she had seen twice in the mansion, both times in the context of meetings she was peripherally serving. A man in his late 50s with gray at his temples and the particular ease of someone who has occupied positions of trust for so long that the ease is no longer performed. It has become structural, built into the way he holds his shoulders and takes up space in a room. He had the face of a man who has earned things over a long time and knows it, and that specific quality of earned confidence is almost impossible to fake, which is why it makes the best cover. 15 years. Adrian said nothing on the drive. He sat in the back of the car beside Celine, Reyes in the front passenger seat, a man named Cole driving, two more vehicles behind them carrying people whose specific purpose she understood without being told. And he looked out the window at the Chicago night moving past, and his face was doing something she had no framework for reading because she had never seen it before on any face. It was grief, she realized after a moment, processed through the specific filter of a man who has trained himself not to display grief, and so displays it as something that resembles nothing so much as absolute stillness. She didn't say anything. She looked out her own window and let him have the stillness. Voss lived in Lincoln Park, a brownstone, 4 stories, the kind of building that costs what it costs and doesn't discuss it. Adrian had the address from a source she didn't ask about. They parked 2 blocks east and came in on foot through the alley. 6 people, including Celine, moving in the way that trained people move through urban darkness, which is differently from how untrained people move, quieter and more deliberate, and with a specific kind of spatial awareness that accounts for sightlines and sound reflection and the variable of other human beings who might be present and might not be. Reyes had his phone to his ear for most of the walk, receiving updates, she assumed, building a picture of the interior, the surrounding street, the current position of Voss, and whoever might be with him. He lowered the phone and fell into step beside Adrian. He's inside. 2nd floor. 2 others confirmed, possibly a 3rd. Armed, Adrian said. Certainly. Voss will know the chain is cut, Celine said. Both men looked at her. The phone that rang and stopped, that was the cutout trying to reach Garrett. When Garrett didn't respond in the expected window, the protocol kicks in. Voss has been waiting for this call for 14 months. He has a contingency. What contingency? Reyes said. I don't know, but it exists. He's had 15 years to build the relationship and 14 months to build the exit. She kept her voice level. He'll have something on Adrian. Documentation, recordings, something that functions as insurance. The contingency is using it, either to bargain or to destroy. Adrian walked for a moment without responding. East side has a fire escape, Reyes said. 2nd floor window is lit. Then he's not running yet, Adrian said. He's deciding. Or he's burning things, Celine said. Adrian stopped walking. In the alley, in the dark, 6 people stopped around him. Go, he said to Reyes. They moved. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not clean, and it was not precise the way movies made these things appear. There was no choreography to it. Reyes's people hit the front entrance and the fire escape simultaneously, and the result was noise, voices, the specific percussion of a door being forced, something falling on a hard floor above them. Celine stayed at street level because Adrian had put a hand on her arm when she moved toward the entrance and said simply, "Not yet." And she had made the calculation that arguing would cost more time than compliance. She stood on the sidewalk and listened to the building. 30 seconds. 40. A window on the 2nd floor opened. Not the lit one, the dark one at the north end. She saw movement, a shape in the window frame, someone looking down, assessing the drop. "North window," she said, loud enough for Adrian beside her. He was already moving. She went with him around the corner and arrived at the north face of the building in time to see a man drop from the window ledge. Not a panicked drop, a controlled one. Hands catching the ledge and lowering before releasing, landing in a crouch with the specific physical competence of someone who has kept himself in condition for exactly this kind of contingency. The man stood up. He was not Voss. He was younger, 30s, dark jacket, and he had something in his right hand that caught the ambient light from the street, and she identified it immediately, and her body moved before the identification was fully conscious, stepping sideways and pulling Adrian's arm so that the 2 of them were against the building wall and not in the line of the alley. The shot went wide. The sound of it in the confined space between buildings was enormous, a physical pressure that hit her in the chest and the ears simultaneously. She heard Adrian swear, short, bitten off. And then Reyes was coming around the other end of the alley at a run, and the man with the gun was making the calculation every armed person makes when the arithmetic of the room shifts against them. And he made the wrong calculation, which was to run rather than surrender. And what happened after that, she didn't watch because Adrian's hand was on her shoulder and he was saying her name and she was checking her own body for damage, which was the correct priority. She was intact. Her ears were ringing. "Are you?" "I'm fine," she said. Her voice sounded wrong in her own head, flattened by the auditory shock. "I'm fine, Voss." Inside, they went in through the front entrance. The door was open, one of Reyes's people stationed at the frame. The hallway was narrow, dark wood, the kind of interior that has been maintained rather than renovated. Stairs directly ahead, light from the second-floor landing. Voices up there, not shouting, the compressed, urgent voices of people managing a situation. She went up the stairs two at a time. The second floor was a single large room running front to back. A study, books on 3 walls, a large desk near the rear window, a fireplace on the north wall that had been used recently enough that there was still heat coming from it. She registered all of this in the first 2 seconds because registering rooms was a reflex, and she couldn't turn it off even now, even with her ears still ringing and her hands carrying a vibration that wasn't quite shaking. Daniel Voss was standing behind the desk. He was not attempting to run. He was not reaching for anything. He was standing with his hands visible at his sides, and his posture was the most frightening thing in the room, completely composed. The posture of a man who has already passed through the fear and come out the other side of it into a place that looks like calm and is something much colder. 2 of Reyes's people had him, one flanking left, one right, both at angles. He was paying neither of them any particular attention. He was looking at Adrian. Adrian walked into the room and stopped approximately 10 feet from the desk and looked at Daniel Voss. And the specific quality of that look, not rage, not betrayal, something beyond and beneath both, made the temperature of the room feel like it dropped 5 degrees. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Voss said, "Adrian." His voice was the same as she'd heard it in passing, measured, warm, the voice of a man accustomed to being believed. Adrian said nothing. "I know what Garrett told you," Voss said. "Before you proceed based on that, you should know that Garrett has reasons to redirect attention." A pause. "He's been managing his own exposure for months. This is a—" "Don't," Adrian said. The word landed hard enough to stop Voss mid-sentence. "The documentation is gone," Voss said after a moment. "If that's what you came for. I burned it 20 minutes ago." Celine looked at the fireplace. The heat was still coming off it. Something thicker than wood ash, a chemical smell underneath the wood smoke. Paper, and something else, plastic-coated perhaps, the specific odor of things that were designed to hold information being destroyed. "Everything," Voss said. 14 months of everything." "Why?" Adrian said. Voss looked at him. "Not why did you burn it?" Adrian said. "Why?" The silence had a different weight now. Not the silence of people managing a tactical situation, the silence of 2 men in 15 years. Voss looked at the desk surface. Something moved across his face, the first thing that had moved there since she'd entered the room. Not guilt. Not quite. Something more complicated than guilt, something that had been sitting with itself for long enough that it had been processed into a different shape. "Viscari was going to move on you regardless," Voss said. 14 months ago or 14 years ago. He was always going to come for what you built. I made a calculation." "You made a deal," Adrian said. "I made a calculation that there was a version of what was coming where you survived, where the operation survived, where the people in it survived." His voice was still level, still warm. That was the most disturbing thing about it. Viscari wanted intelligence. I provided intelligence that was managed, that kept him satisfied without giving him what he actually needed to. "February 14th, Adrian said. A pause. "That was not my decision," Voss said. "Whose decision was it?" "The car was Viscari's initiative. He used channels I didn't control. I didn't know until afterward." Something shifted in his voice on this. A register change so slight that if she hadn't been listening for it, she would have missed it. "I shut down 2 of his cutouts the following week. That's why there was a 4-month gap before the next attempt." Celine had been standing to the left of the doorway since entering, out of the primary sight line, which was habit. She'd been watching Voss's hands, his weight distribution, the micro signals that aggregate into something more reliable than anything verbal. He was telling a partial truth. Some of what he was saying was real. The part about the car was the lie. She didn't know how she knew this. She knew it the way she knew the wine steward's hands were too still, the way she knew the dessert table corner was wrong, a convergence of small signals that her brain assembled below the level of articulable reasoning and surfaced as certainty. He had known about February 14th. "He's lying about the car," she said. Both men looked at her. Voss for the first time was something other than composure, a flash of something quickly managed that was the first genuinely uncontrolled thing she'd seen him produce. That flash confirmed it. "Who are you?" Voss said. His voice had changed, slightly. The warmth recalibrated into something more precise. "Nobody important," she said. "You're the waitress." He said it the way Viscari had said it in the ballroom, recalibrating. "You're the one from the dinner. I'm the one who put the knife to Viscari's throat, yes." Voss looked at her for a long moment. The evaluation in his look was different from Adrian's evaluation and different from Reyes's. It was the evaluation of a man who understands information as a commodity and is rapidly repricing an asset he had previously undervalued. "You've been watching this household," he said. Not a question. "I work in this household." "You've been watching it," he said again. "For how long?" 22 days. He looked at Adrian. "Where did you find her?" "Employment agency," Adrian said. His voice had a dryness in it that was almost humor and was actually the furthest thing from humor. 22 days, Voss said. He looked back at her. "And you made Garrett." "The phrase he used," she said. "The house knows. He said it in the kitchen 8 days ago. He used it as verbal punctuation, habitual, unguarded. People give themselves away most cleanly in the spaces where they've stopped watching themselves." Voss was quiet. "You knew about the car," she said. "February 14th. You knew in advance. The 4-month gap wasn't you shutting down cutouts. It was recalibration after the attempt failed. Viscari pulled back to reassess, and you let him reassess because it bought you time and because the alternative was losing the arrangement." She watched his face while she said it. She watched the warmth finish, leaving it. "You have good instincts," he said. "That's a dangerous quality in the wrong environment, I've been told." "The question you should be asking yourself," he said, and now his voice had shed the last of the warmth, and what was left was precise and clean and genuinely cold, "is whether what you've walked into is something you can walk back out of. Because what you know about tonight, what you've seen in this house, what you've been part of, that's not a door that opens from both sides." She held his eyes. "I stopped expecting doors to open from both sides a long time ago," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at Adrian. "There's something you need to know," he said, "before this goes any further in the direction you're planning to take it." He shifted his weight slightly. She tracked his hands. They stayed still. "Viscari is not the primary problem. He never was. Viscari is the instrument, the organization behind him, the one that's been funding his expansion for the last 3 years, the one that owns the financing structure underneath his operation. That's what you're actually dealing with, and that organization knows this address. It knows about this conversation, and it has contingencies that have nothing to do with me or Garrett or anyone in this room." Adrian looked at him. "How long?" he said. "How long have they been positioned?" 3 years. Maybe longer. Viscari is a vehicle, a useful one, but replaceable." Voss looked at the desk surface again. The first time he'd looked away from one of them since the conversation began, and she noted it because it was the tell of someone arriving at information they'd been carrying for a long time and are now making the decision to put down. They were going to move through Viscari, use his operation to acquire yours, then absorb both. "And you knew this," Adrian said. "I've known it for 8 months." "And you Adrian stopped, started again. 8 months. "I was trying to find a way to—" "You were managing your position," Adrian said. The dryness was completely gone now. What was in his voice instead was something she had not heard there before and did not want to hear again. "You were deciding which side to be on when it resolved." Voss said nothing. "What do they want?" Adrian said. "The port contracts, the distribution infrastructure, the financing relationships, Everything that took you 15 years to build. Voss met his eyes. They don't want to destroy it, Adrian. They want to own it. There's a difference. Not from where I'm standing. A silence. Viscari is meeting with their primary representative tonight, Voss said. 2 hours from now. A location on the North Shore. He paused. If you want to know who you're actually dealing with, that's where the answer is. Adrian looked at him for a long time. Why are you telling me this? He said. Voss looked at the fireplace. The ash was still settling. Because I burned the documentation, he said. Because there's a version of this where you walk out of it intact and the people behind Viscari don't. He looked back at Adrian. And because 15 years means something to me even if it doesn't look like it from where you're standing. The room was very quiet. Celine looked at Adrian. She watched him sit with this. All of it, the 15 years and the documentation ash and February 14th and the 2 hours and the North Shore. And she watched him make the specific calculation that a man makes when the information he's being given is simultaneously the most useful thing he's heard and the most dangerous. Because useful information from a compromised source is only useful if you can independently verify the angle, and verification requires time. And they had 2 hours. He looked at her. She understood what he was asking without the question being spoken. She looked at Voss. She thought about every microsignal she'd tracked since entering the room. The weight shift, the hand positions, the register changes, the flash when she'd named the lie about the car, the quality of the stillness when he'd looked at the fireplace. The information about the North Shore meeting was true. She didn't know how she was this certain. She was. She nodded once. Adrian looked at Reyes. Get the address, he said. Reyes moved to Voss, and whatever happened in the next few minutes in that second-floor room she was present for but not fully tracking because her mind was already doing the other thing, the forward calculation. 2 hours, North Shore, an organization she knew nothing about except what a compromised man had just told her. An organization with contingencies that were already in motion. And Adrian moving toward a confrontation that he had not planned for and had not prepared for, and was going to walk into anyway because a man like Adrian Moretti, whatever else he was, did not sit in a room and wait for the structure of his life to be acquired. She thought about her mother in Pilsen, awake now, arguing with Manny's people about why she didn't need assistance. She thought about the knife in the ballroom, the 7 inches of worn composite handle, the way it had felt in her hand. Not wrong. Necessary. She thought about the words she still didn't have for what she was now, in this life, standing in this room. Reyes had the address. Adrian looked at her. You don't have to come, he said. She looked back at him. 2 hours, she said. We need to move. They went down the stairs and out into the Chicago night, and the cars were waiting, and everyone moved with the concentrated purpose of people who have passed through the point of managing a situation into the point of ending one. And Celine Hart got into the car and felt the vibration of the road through the frame of the vehicle and listened to her own heartbeat, which was elevated but steady, and she thought, the North Shore in October was dark water and cold air, and no witnesses. And whatever was waiting for them at the end of this drive was not the kind of thing you survived by being invisible. She had spent her entire life being invisible. Tonight she was going to have to be something else entirely. The car accelerated onto the expressway. 47 minutes to the North Shore. Somewhere ahead, in a building she hadn't seen yet, a meeting was happening between men who believed they had already won. And the only thing standing between that belief and the reality was a woman in a black service uniform who had once put a knife against a kingpin's throat and told him, with absolute certainty, in a voice that didn't waver, that she would not say it again. She hadn't been wrong then. She intended not to be wrong now. The city fell away behind them. The darkness ahead of the headlights was complete, and the car kept moving into it, and Celine pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed through her nose and counted the miles the way she counted everything. Not for comfort, but for information, because information was the only currency she had ever truly trusted, and she was going to need every unit of it in the next 47. The North Shore in October smelled like lake water and dead leaves, and the specific cold that comes off Lake Michigan when the season has turned completely and is no longer pretending otherwise. Celine counted the miles by the change in the road. Expressway giving way to suburban surface streets. Surface streets giving way to the winding 2-lane roads that served the properties along the lakefront, properties that were large enough and private enough that the sound of what happened on them rarely traveled as far as anyone who needed to hear it. 47 minutes in the car, and then they were stopped 200 yards short of a gate, pulled into a gravel turnout screened by a stand of mature oaks that had lost half their leaves, and the engine went off, and the darkness was complete except for the ambient glow from the property ahead. She could see the building through the trees. A lake house, though that term undersold it. 4 stories, modern construction, all glass and dark steel on the lake-facing side. The kind of architecture that announces itself as money without needing to speak. Lights on the 2nd and 3rd floors. 2 vehicles visible in the curved drive. Reyes was on the phone in the front seat, low and fast, receiving information from people she hadn't seen tonight, the outer web of Adrian's operation that she was only beginning to understand the scope of. She sat in the back beside Adrian and did not speak and did not look at him, because there was a quality to his silence right now that required space around it. He had not said anything in 40 minutes. She understood. 15 years. The number kept returning, not as an abstraction, but as a weight. 15 years of building something, of making decisions that cost what they cost, of accumulating the specific scars that come from operating in the world that Adrian Moretti operated in, and the person you trusted most in all of it had been the instrument of its potential destruction. That was not the kind of information you processed in 40 minutes in a car. That was the kind of information you carried for years, in the specific part of the body that holds things that cannot be put down. She knew something about that kind of carrying. Reyes lowered the phone. 3 men confirmed on the property. Viscari arrived 20 minutes ago. The representative... He paused. The name our source provided checks out. It's real. Who is it? Adrian said. Reyes told him. She watched Adrian's face receive the name. Watched it do nothing, which was its own kind of answer. You know him, she said. By reputation. Adrian looked at the building through the trees. He's been legitimate for 20 years, or appeared to be. Appeared to be, she said. Yes. So this organization has been operating behind legitimate cover for at least 20 years. At least, she thought about this. About what it meant to build something that looked, from every external angle, like one thing, while being another thing entirely underneath. She thought about how that differed from what Adrian had built, and she found, with some discomfort, that the difference was thinner than she wanted it to be. What do you want to do? She said. He looked at the building. I want to walk in there, he said, and end this. With 3 armed men, Viscari, and a representative from an organization that's been building toward this for 3 years. Yes. That's not a plan. That's a direction. He looked at her then, the first time in 40 minutes. Something in his face that was the closest she had ever seen him come to the kind of vulnerability that lives in the space between knowing what you want and knowing what it will cost. What would you do? He said. She looked at the building. She had been building a picture since Voss's 2nd-floor study, assembling information the way she always assembled it, not consciously but continuously, the specific background process that ran in her at all times and surfaced when she needed it. The vehicles in the drive, the lit floors, the number of men, the geography of the property, lake on the west side, access road on the east, the tree line to the north that they were currently sitting inside. The meeting is on the 2nd floor, she said. The lights. There's a terrace on the lakeside. I can see the railing from here. 2nd floor terrace means a door, probably glass, probably unlocked because they're not expecting anyone to come from the lakeside. They came in from the road. They're watching the road. The lake, Adrian said. It's October. The water temperature. I know what the water temperature is, she said. I also know that the terrace door is 60 yards from the tree line on the north side of the property, which avoids the drive and the front entrance entirely. She looked at him. I'm not saying swim. I'm saying the tree line runs to within 30 feet of the north wall. From there, it's a drainage easement that goes to the back of the building. Reyes turned around from the front seat. She pointed through the windshield at the dark gap between the property's landscape lighting. There, she said. The lighting has a dead zone on the north face. Either it's a design gap or it was left intentionally for maintenance access. Either way, it's dark for 40 feet. Reyes looked where she was pointing, looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at her. You've been looking at this property for 4 minutes, he said. 3.5. A silence. All right, he said. They went in from the north. Reyes took 2 of his people around the east side to cover the drive in the front entrance, quietly. No engagement unless things went wrong inside, which was the variable nobody could fully account for. Adrian and Celine and a man named Torres went through the dead zone on the north face, moving through the gap in the landscape, lighting in a line. No flashlights, feeling the ground change from grass to gravel to the concrete of the drainage easement. The north wall of this building had a utility entrance, a plain steel door, not the architectural glass of the public-facing sides. It was locked. Torres had it open in 90 seconds with tools she didn't ask about, and then they were inside, in a service corridor that smelled like cleaning products and recirculated air. The infrastructure of a building that had been designed to have its working parts invisible. Service stairs, steel and concrete. They went up in single file, no sound except the specific, unavoidable sound of 3 people breathing. First floor landing, second floor landing. Adrian put his hand on the door and looked at her. She listened. Voices on the other side of the door. 3 distinct registers. The specific rhythm of a conversation that is approaching its conclusion. The cadence change of men who have agreed on something and are moving toward the formalization of the agreement. She held up 3 fingers. Confirmed. Then she heard a 4th voice, and something in it made her close her hand into a fist instead. The 4th voice was familiar, not from the North Shore, not from the past 48 hours. Familiar from 22 days of moving through rooms in the Moretti household. Familiar from a kitchen, from a hallway, from the specific brief exchanges that constitute the social fabric of domestic service. She looked at Adrian. His face had gone absolutely still. She saw him recognize it at the same moment she did. The 4th voice belonged to Dorota, the head housekeeper. Compact, efficient, communicating primarily in sighs and pointed gestures, the woman who had walked Celine through the household routine on her first morning without warmth or hostility, simply with the practiced brevity of someone who has explained the same things many times and expects competence in return. Dorota, who knew every room in that household and every person in it and every schedule and every vulnerability and every door that should stay locked. Dorota, who had been there longer than Garrett, longer than Reyes, longer than almost anyone. Adrian's hand came off the door. She watched him stand in the stairwell and absorb this, and it was worse than Voss. She could see it. Voss had been a professional relationship, a 15-year alliance that had been corrupted by calculation. Dorota was something else. Dorota was the texture of daily life, the person who managed the household in which he lived, who had access to everything that Garrett and Voss combined had only partial access to, who had been present and invisible in the way that Celine herself had been present and invisible, except for far longer and toward an entirely different purpose. She touched his arm, very lightly. Just the contact, not pressure, not guidance, just acknowledgement. He looked at her. She held his eyes and shook her head once, very slightly. Not now, not here, not like this. He understood. He put his hand back on the door. They went through. The second floor opened into a large room that was both living space and what appeared to be a working space. A long table with chairs, documents, a laptop, the infrastructure of a meeting that had been using this room for longer than tonight. The lake-facing wall was entirely glass, and the darkness of the water beyond it made the room feel exposed in a specific way, like standing in a lit window at night. Viscari was at the table. He looked up when the door opened, and his face went through several rapid transitions. Surprise, calculation, and then something that on a different man might have been resignation, but on Viscari landed closer to the specific contempt of someone who has been inconvenienced by an outcome they believe is still recoverable. Beside him, 2 men she didn't know. And across the table, in a chair that faced the door, a man in his early 60s in a dark suit whose face she recognized now from the description Adrian had given her in the car. The representative. The face of the organization that had been building toward this moment for 3 years. His name was Harlan Cole. She would not have picked him out of any crowd. He had the face of a retired academic, wire-rimmed glasses, a quality of considered calm that looked so natural on him that it had probably never raised suspicion in any room he'd occupied. And Dorota. Standing to the side near the kitchen access, with a coffee service in front of her that made her look almost exactly like what she had always appeared to be. The coffee service was the tell. Of course she had the coffee service. She had always had something in her hands. 7 people in the room. 4 of them with weapons, she estimated, possibly 5. She had no weapon. Adrian had a gun. Torres had a gun and whatever else Torres carried that she hadn't inventoried. The math was not good. But Reyes was outside. And Harlan Cole did not yet know about Reyes. Cole stood up from his chair. Slowly. No sudden movements, the specific body language of a man accustomed to de-escalation, who understands that the person who controls the room's temperature controls the room. Adrian, he said. His voice was the voice of a man who has known your name for a long time and is only saying it now. I had hoped this particular conversation would happen under different circumstances. I'm sure you did, Adrian said. This doesn't have to be what it looks like. What does it look like? Adrian said. Cole spread his hand slightly. An ending. And I don't want an ending. I want a continuation. Everything we've discussed. He gestured toward the table, the documents, the visible infrastructure of the meeting, is about continuation. The structure you've built over 15 years is exceptional. It deserves to be protected. By you, Adrian said, by a framework that can insulate it from exactly this kind of disruption. What Viscari represents isn't aggression, Adrian. It's an invitation to become part of something that doesn't have the vulnerabilities that... You funded Viscari for 3 years to take what I built, Adrian said. His voice was very quiet. You put Garrett inside my operation. You had Voss managing my exposure to make sure I didn't see it coming. And in February, you tried to kill me in a car that was supposed to look like ice on the road. He looked at Cole. That's not an invitation. That's an acquisition by attrition. Cole looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Celine. And this is the woman who started the unraveling, he said. The waitress. Her name, Adrian said, is Celine Hart. Cole looked at her with the careful attention of a man performing a final assessment, not hostile, more academic. The look of someone who has studied a problem and is recalculating the variable that has thrown off his model. 22 days, he said. 23 now, she said. You cost us significantly. Good, she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he did something she hadn't predicted. He sat back down. And in sitting down, he made a decision visible, a decision about how this room was going to go. And the decision was that it was going to go the way he directed it, because he was the person in the room whose authority was structural rather than situational, and structural authority does not need to stand up to assert itself. Viscari, he said. And Viscari moved, not toward Adrian, toward Celine. It was tactically correct, she understood that, in the half-second before his hands were on her. She was the unaccounted variable. She was the one without the gun. She was the one whose removal from the equation simplified the room's arithmetic the most. Viscari was 63 years old, but he had the grip of a man who has been in physical confrontations for 40 years and knows how to use momentum and surprise, and he used both. And she went into the wall beside the kitchen access hard enough to feel it through her shoulder blades and the back of her skull. She didn't go down. She hit the wall and pushed off it before Viscari had completed the motion, using his own momentum the way she'd learned, not from training, she'd never had formal training, but from 3 years of intake clinic and 26 years of situations where going down meant staying down. She got an elbow into his sternum on the redirect and heard him grunt and felt the grip loosen, and she was out of it, 3 feet of distance, which was enough. Adrian had his gun up. Both of the unknown men had their weapons out. Torres had his weapon out and was calculating angles. And Dorota had moved away from the coffee service and was standing near the glass wall with her hands visible and her face arranged in the specific expression of someone who has been in this industry long enough to know when the exit strategy needs to activate. The room was a gun problem. Too many guns, too small a space, too many people for whom a missed shot had catastrophic consequences. She had been in the ballroom with a knife and one person, and that had been clean relative to this. This was not clean. This was the kind of situation where the first shot changed everything, and the first shot could come from 6 different hands, and none of them were hers. She thought very fast. Cole was the linchpin, not Viscari. Viscari was the instrument, as Voss had said, replaceable, already being held in the specific limbo of a man whose value is contingent on the success of a plan that is visibly failing. Cole was the one whose authority held the room's structure together. Remove Cole's authority, and the room lost its architecture. She looked at Cole. He was watching the standoff with the calm of a man who has been in standoffs and knows that they resolve in favor of the person with the most structural leverage, and he believed that person was him, and he was still running that calculation, which meant he had not yet fully updated his model to account for the variable sitting outside the building in the dark. "Reyes," she said. Clearly. To the room, not to Adrian. Cole's eyes moved to the glass wall. She watched the update happen, watched him calculate the implications. Reyes outside meant the drive was covered, meant the exit was closed, meant the structural leverage was not where he had been calculating it to be. "You brought his whole operation," Cole said. "Enough of it," she said. A silence. "This ends with you in custody, or it ends worse than that," she said. "Those are the only options currently available. The documentation you were expecting from Voss was burned 2 hours ago. Garrett is in custody. The chain is cut." She held his eyes. "You came here tonight to close a 3-year acquisition. The acquisition is over." Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Adrian. "She speaks for you," he said. Not sarcastically, genuinely recalibrating. "Yes," Adrian said. Cole took off his glasses, cleaned them with the specific unhurried motion of a man who needs a moment that looks like composure and is actually recalculation. Put them back on. "All right," he said. Viscari moved again, but not toward anyone in the room, toward the glass wall, toward the terrace door. The exit she had identified from the car, the one she'd been right about, and for a moment she thought he was going to make it because everyone in the room was watching Cole and managing Cole, and Viscari was already at the door, hands on the frame. She crossed the room in 10 feet and hit the door with the flat of her hand above his, adding weight to it, and Viscari turned and she was right there, inside his space, and she looked at him from 8 inches away and said, "You put 2 men at a 61-year-old woman's apartment tonight." He looked at her. "She can't walk without help," she said. "She weighs 115 pounds, and she can't walk without help, and you sent 2 men to her door." Her voice was level. She needed it to be level. "We're done moving." He looked at her for a long moment. He stepped back from the door. She didn't know if it was the look on her face or the gun that Adrian now had trained at the back of Viscari's head. She didn't care. Reyes came through the front entrance 8 minutes later, and the room resolved the way rooms resolve when the structural authority has been removed. Not dramatically, not cleanly, but completely, like the last tension leaving a cable that has been cut. Cole's 2 men stood down. Viscari stood at the glass wall and looked at the lake. Torres handled the weapons. And Dorota was sitting in a chair at the long table with her hands folded in front of her. And when Celine came and sat across from her, she looked up with an expression that was complicated and tired, and something Celine recognized, the specific exhaustion of a person who has been carrying 2 things for a long time and is now no longer required to carry either. "How long?" Celine said. Dorota looked at her hands. "Since before Voss," she said. Her English, always precise, was more precise now, stripped of the particular vocal texture she had always used around the household, as if the performance had come down. "Since the 3rd year." 12 years, Celine said. "Yes." "Why?" Dorota looked up. Her eyes were the color of winter sky, and they were very steady. "I had a daughter," she said, "before Chicago, before this work. She needed something I couldn't give her on what this job paid. Cole's people gave it to me instead." A pause. "She died anyway, 4 years after." She looked at her hands again. "And then I had been doing this for 4 years, and there was nothing left that was not this, so I kept doing it." Celine sat with this, She thought about what she would have done, at 22, in a different city, with a child who needed something she couldn't give, if someone had offered her the price in exchange for the cost. She thought about her mother's apartment in Pilsen, the 3rd-floor walk-up, the medication schedule, the weekly appointment times, the $1,100 in a fireproof box that represented 4 months of careful saving. She didn't say anything. She didn't know what to say that wouldn't be a lie, and she had spent too much of her life telling the truth to start lying now at the moment that mattered most. She left Dorota to Reyes. She walked to the glass wall and stood where Viscari had stood and looked at the lake. October. And the water was black and absolute, and the wind off it was cold enough to feel through her uniform, the black service uniform she had been wearing since the ballroom, the uniform she had not gone back to the household to change out of because there had been no time, because this was the night, and the night had not waited for her to become someone else before beginning. She heard Adrian come to stand beside her. He stood there for a while without speaking. She could see his reflection in the glass, and behind both of them the room was being organized, people being detained, calls being made, the aftermath machinery doing what it does. "Dorota," he said finally. 12 years, she said. She heard him breathe. Nobody does, she said. That's the point. The people who are good at this, the people who are genuinely inside it and not just performing, they're the ones you never suspect because the performance is indistinguishable from the real thing. She looked at his reflection. I didn't see Dorota either, not until I heard her voice in that stairwell. Why not? Because I was looking for what was wrong. Dorota was so far inside the household that she'd stopped registering as a variable. She was furniture. She paused. The same way I was furniture. That's how it works. He was quiet. I owe you something, he said. She looked at the lake. You don't owe me anything, she said. I owe you considerably more than I can currently account for. His voice was the same as it always was, flat, measured, but there was something underneath it that she had only heard there a few times, in the kitchen before dawn, in the study after the ballroom, the thing that lived beneath the professional surface and came out in the spaces where he had run out of the management. My life is one thing. What you protected tonight is... He stopped, started differently. The work Garrett and Voss and Dorota did over 14 months could have ended everything. Cole's organization was 6 weeks from completing the acquisition. I had no idea the exposure was that deep. A pause. I've been building this for 15 years, and a woman I hired 3 weeks ago to fill water glasses understood the threat better than anyone I had in place. I grew up in Englewood, she said. You learn to see things early, or you don't learn anything at all. It's more than that. She said nothing. You chose to act, he said. Every time. The delivery driver, the wine steward, the knife. Tonight. You had 20 opportunities to stay invisible, and you chose every time not to. He paused. Why? She thought about this genuinely, not the quick answer, the real one. Because doing nothing has a cost, she said finally. People think it doesn't. They think staying out of it is neutral. But I've been in enough rooms to know that doing nothing is a choice with consequences the same as doing something. The consequences just hit someone else. She looked at the lake. I couldn't afford that. I never could. The wind off the water moved between them and then was gone. What do you want? He said. From here. From whatever this is now. She turned to look at him directly, not at his reflection, at his face, which was doing the thing it did when the management was completely down, open in the specific way that cost something. I want my mother safe, she said. Permanent arrangement. Not because of tonight, because it should have happened before tonight, and it didn't, and I can't keep waiting for the right moment to make sure she's protected. Done. I want to understand what I'm part of before I decide whether to be part of it. You have an operation that has Garrett in it, and Voss in it, and Dorota in it, and God knows what else I haven't seen yet. I need to know what I'm looking at before I decide what I'm willing to do with what I see. That's fair, he said. And I want to go back to the household tonight, she said, not as staff, not as whatever the alternative is until we figure out what the alternative is. Just back. Because my mother's medical documents are in a fireproof box under my bed, and I need to reorganize them back into the right order. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, not the kind that belongs to social performance, but something smaller and more real than that, the kind of thing a face does when it's been surprised by something that isn't threatening. All right, he said. They drove back to the city as the sky began to lose its darkness. Not dawn yet, the hour before dawn, when the black transitions to something that's almost gray but hasn't committed. Celine sat in the back seat beside Adrian and looked out the window at the city emerging from the dark, and she thought about how different Chicago looked from a car moving through it at this hour than it did from any other angle, and she thought about her mother arguing with Manny's people about assistance she hadn't asked for, And she thought about Dorota's winter sky eyes and the daughter who had died anyway. And she thought about the knife with the worn black composite handle that she had left on the dessert table and never retrieved, which seemed, at this particular distance, like the right ending for it. She did not think about what she was now. She would think about that later, in the specific daylight that makes those questions answerable. For now, she was just a woman in a car moving through a city she knew in her bones, watching the sky decide to change. And that was enough. The mansion came into view at 6:40 in the morning. The oaks were bare now. She hadn't noticed them shedding the last of their leaves, but in the pale pre-dawn light, the branches were clean against the sky, stripped down to their essential structure. The iron gate opened as the car approached. The household was asleep, or nearly so. She got out of the car. The gravel of the drive was wet with condensation. The cold was real, the kind that gets into your hands if you let it. Adrian walked beside her to the entrance. At the door, he stopped. "There's a formal dinner next week," he said. "Associates. People who need to understand that what happened with Viscari and Cole is finished and that the operation is intact." He paused. "I'd like you there. Not as staff." She looked at him. "What would I be there as?" she said. He considered this. "Someone whose judgment I trust," he said. "Someone who sees things other people don't. Someone who—" He stopped. The thing beneath the management was fully visible now, at 6:40 in the morning, in the cold, with both of them having not slept and the weight of the night sitting on everything. "Someone I don't want to operate without." She stood with this for a moment. She thought about the last 30 days, about the employment agency and Patricia's reading glasses on a beaded chain and the motivational poster with the mustachioed stock photo businessman, about coffee ratios and folded linens and a wine steward with two still hands, about a knife hidden under a dessert table and a ballroom full of killers and the specific weight of another person's pulse against a blade. She thought about what it meant to choose a thing, really choose it, with full knowledge of the cost and the exposure and the version of yourself you had to become to sustain the choice. "I'll be there," she said. He nodded. Once. She went inside. She went up the stairs to the staff quarters corridor, which was still just a corridor, and to her room, which was still just a room, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and opened the fireproof box and took out her mother's discharge paperwork and her own identification, and she reorganized them back into the order she kept them. Her ID on the outside, the emergency contacts behind it, the medication schedule in the middle where she could find it fast, but didn't have to see it every time she opened the box. She put the box on the shelf in the wardrobe and left the wardrobe door fully closed. She lay down on the bed in her service uniform and looked at the ceiling. Through the single window, the sky was beginning to make its decision about being daylight. The gray was warming at its edges, not to gold yet, just to the pale version of itself that precedes color. She thought about the bolero, her mother's voice, thin and slightly off-key, filling a small kitchen on Sunday mornings. She couldn't remember the name of the song. She had asked her mother once, and her mother had said she didn't know either. She had learned it from her own mother, who had learned it from someone before that. And somewhere in the chain the original title had been lost, and only the melody remained. That was what survival looked like most of the time. Not the knife in the ballroom, not the North Shore, not any of the dramatic crystalline moments that you could point to and say, that was it, that was the turn. Most of the time, survival was a melody carried forward through people who couldn't tell you the name of it, passed hand to hand through the dark until it reached someone who would carry it into the next morning. She had done that. She would keep doing it. Her eyes closed. The window let in the first pale light of an October morning over Chicago. And Celine Hart, not the waitress, not yet whatever came after, simply a woman who had refused every opportunity to look away from the things that mattered, slept. Outside, the oaks held their bare branches against a sky that had finally decided to be day. Everything that had burned was ash now. What remained was real. End.